Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Australian University Student Media Conference. Thanks everyone for coming. We've got heaps of things planned this weekend, and we're really happy to see you all here. So from everyone who's come from Adelaide, from Sydney, from Melbourne, even the people who've come from Belconnen, thanks so much for making the trip over.
My name is AJ Nielsen. I'm managing editor of Woroni, a new student's newspaper, and this is Cam Wilson, who is the editor-in-chief. So we're here basically to give you just a brief introduction as to how this conference came about and what's going to happen this weekend.
Cool, so this conference came about, someone whispered in my ear about a year ago about having a student media conference, and I thought it was a pretty good idea, mainly because of the fact that us kids down in Canberra are pretty lonely, and we don't have a whole lot of university newspapers or radio stations to copy off. So, so we decided to get all you guys down here, use everything that we've got down here, the great media personalities, the liberal SAF money, Questacon, to bring the greatest and brightest minds that student journalism has to offer.
And what we have to offer, my goodness. Sorry, segue. Great. So, Friday, tonight, we have the welcome drinks and registration, which you've already done. If you haven't registered tonight, just a bit of housekeeping. You can come along to the workshops tomorrow and register then. Give you your lovely bags and name tags and some things like that. Tonight we have a fabulous media Q&A panel with Michelle Grattan, Bernard Keane, Benjamin Law and Tracey Spicer, and Tom Westland, our MC, will introduce you to them a little bit more in the future. Tomorrow we have a fabulous array of workshops in your student guides that you've received in your lovely little show bags. You can see what's going on there. And then on Sunday we have some more workshops, some brunch and lunch and dinner, and a little closing picnic, which will be really lovely. Oh, and tomorrow night we have a ball.
So just before we get started on the panel, we thought we'd do a few thank yous to the amazing people who've made this conference happen. So we've got 6 other editors who've done so much work on this. We've got Faz, our radio editor. We've got Yasmin, our visual designer. We've got Gus, our print editor. We have Ben, our content editor. Josh, our content editor. Vincent, who's the deputy editor-in-chief. I think that's everyone. So yeah. Yeah, and us too. So thanks to everyone who's helped out. Thanks to all everyone for coming and all the sub-editors who've come to help out as well. So I guess before we get started, we'll just introduce the MC.
Yeah, this is Tom Westland. He's really funny. He's also a former editor-in-chief of Woroni. And oh, sorry,
Still a sore point.
Still a sore point, in fact. So Tom is here.
And he described himself as the only editor from his cohort of 4 who didn't end up working for the UN or committing crimes.
Actually true.
So he's not the most interesting one, but he's the best we have to offer. So here is Tom Westland.
Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the conference, welcome to Canberra for those of you who come here. It's Canberra's 100th birthday, actually. So I hope you enjoy yourself and good luck finding your way out. Not the only place or only thing having a birthday at the moment. Last night, I'm sure you all know, was the Institute for Public Affairs' 70th birthday. If you don't know what happened there, head along to Crikey, they've got a lovely anonymous account of it. Luminaries such as Gina Reinhardt, Rupert Murdoch gave a speech, and Andrew Bolt was there moderating. So basically, we understand none of you were invited to that. So this is our version of it here tonight. I'll let you guess who's playing who.
I can pack your phone.
I'm not as abrasive as Andrew Bolt. I'm slightly more numerate, so this might not be as interesting as it was last night. But if you'd like to make it a little more interesting and you feel like heckling, by all means, have a go. That said, we're going to leave questions right until the end. We're going to have a long period for questions. So if you do have a question, hold on to it, write it down on your smartphone application thing. I don't know what they are, and we'll get to them right at the end. And now, I'd like to give a little more formal introduction to our panel, our illustrious panel. Let's go from right to left, my right. So we'll start with Mr. Bernard Keane, who was described by the commenters on Andrew Bolt's blog as an enemy of freedom and a facilitator of Stalinist media policy. But while he's not slaughtering the kulaks, he is chief political correspondent for Crikey.com.au, which is some sort of newspaper on computers. Again, I don't really understand how it works.
It's Crikey.
And a professional debunker of conventional wisdom and a former public servant, I believe. So it fits right in, because most people in a sort of 10-kilometre radius of here are public servants. The next panellist needs no introduction, but because I love the sound of my own voice, I'm going to give her one anyway. It is Michelle Grattan, who has worked for just about every publication I think that Fairfax Media puts out at some stage in her career, ending up as political editor for The Age, from which she retired recently to take up a job with the University of Canberra, from which she writes for The Conversation, also another online outlet, Brave New World. And she was also, for those of you playing along at home in Canberra, the first woman to edit a metropolitan daily in Australia. She was editor of the Canberra Times for a while. So she's very special welcome. Our next guest, you may remember if you are my generation and you watched movies on Channel 10 from the little news breaks during James Bond. That's how I first became acquainted with Tracey Spicer. Since those days, she has done an amazing array of journalistic things in all kinds of journalistic fora, I think is the plural. She now reads news for Sky News, am I correct? And writes for just about any publication you can imagine on all sorts of amazing topics, and is very heavily involved with charity work. Please welcome Tracey Spicer, she's amazing. And last but most definitely not least, we have Benjamin Law. Now, I looked up everyone in order to make these little bios on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia tells me that Benjamin Law was born in 1773 in Yorkshire, and is credited with the invention of the shoddy process, which I'm told is some kind of textiles manufacturing something. But this Benjamin Law is a humorist, a writer. He, I think, writes sort of ponderous political tracts for Frankie magazine and pop culture ephemera for The Monthly, or it might be the other way around. He's a very, very fun guy, and we're very happy to have him here. Our panel. So if you consider that the sort of big front page slanderous hit job slash, the first segment that we'd like to get to tonight is kind of the page 2 buried right down the bottom corner correction. In other words, it's personal stories, sort of amorphous title. Basically, the question that we'd like to start off with is, how did you get from whatever, if any, formal education you had to becoming involved in whichever little part of the entertainment industry you now work? Let's start with Ben. How did you get where you are, and how did what you studied at some stage of your life help you or hinder you, and so forth?
When I was a teenager, I read a lot of magazines, and that's the type of writer that I wanted to be. I wanted to write for magazines.
Tom, take my pen off.
How do I do that?
Press the button.
That's what Jesus
And when I was 16, I wrote a letter to Rolling Stone. I was one of those really annoying readers who would write a lot of letters to the editor of Rolling Stone. And one of the letters that I wrote, this incredibly earnest piece about why I, as a 16-year-old, should have been able to vote in the referendum for the Australian Republic, became the letter of the month, and they sent me a stereo, and I thought, this is a really great job that's very well paid, writing for magazines. And so from then on, that was what was in my mind, to write for magazines. I graduated from high school and then I took on a degree. The two choices that were before me was a Bachelor of Journalism at QUT in Brisbane, where I come from, or a Bachelor of Creative Writing. And I knew I didn't want to be a daily news journalist. I didn't think I had the discipline for it. I wanted to write longer things. So I took on creative writing, and I was really lucky at the time. I went into university at a time when creative writing was a very new discipline. It's still relatively new. And as a result, they had to piggyback a lot of journalism subjects, which was great for me because not only was I learning about novels and literature, I was learning about the fundamentals of journalism as well, which my novelist and poet and playwright friends hated, but I loved. When I graduated from that degree, well, I mean, when I was studying my degree, I was also doing a lot of work experience as well. So I was writing for Music Street Press, the free magazines that you pick up off the ground. I was doing a lot of music reviews. By my third year in university, I was editing the student newspaper. And yeah, represent. Doesn't exist anymore though, because I was editing the student magazine/newspaper at QUT at a time, and this will date me very badly, but when they were discussing voluntary student unionism as well. Ooh, and that was pretty much the death knell for that particular magazine. I think it was resurrected briefly in some sort of tragic Lazarus act that didn't last very long. And that was a very good training for me, because from then, having written for Street Press, I was writing for the Metropolitan newspaper Art Pages, and then from there I was writing for glossy magazines, and from there I was writing for publications like Frankie magazine, For the Monthly, for publications I write for now.
Your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, since it was a very amorphous question, I'll give a very amorphous answer. How did I get to where I am today? I slept around an awful lot. What was that song? I am joking. I am being ironic because I'm a feminist. Thank you for laughing. I did a journalism degree at QUT where the lovely Benjamin went in Brisbane. I graduated in 1987. I wanted to be a journalist because I come from a very socially active family and because I thought Young Event was awesome. And I wrote for the student newspaper, and I used to send letters to the editor, to the Courier Mail, with the same person in different bodies, about how Adam Ant was just the best performer ever and everyone should start bagging him. So that was fantastically credible. I did a 3-year journalism degree, couldn't get a job for 6 months because I graduated in 1987. There was a stock market crash in the October of that year. I worked in a shoe shop. I learned an awful lot of humility. I thought I was never going to be a journalist. I finally got a cadetship at a radio station in Brisbane, worked there for a year, then worked at 3AW in Melbourne doing police reporting, went to country television in Gippsland as an industrial reporter and sheep and cow reporter. In my life, I almost fell over when I saw local television in Gippsland where they had equipment being advertised, makes cow handling a pleasure. Had an entirely different meaning to a city girl. So I learned an awful lot doing 3 stories a day and then reading the news at night in the country. Then I went to Channel 9 in Melbourne where I learned an awful lot about sexism, when the news director yelled across the room one day, I want 2 inches off your hair and 2 inches off your ass. Then I went to Channel 10 as a reporter down there and a newsreader. I got a newsreading job in Brisbane after that. where the station manager said on the first night, I said, how do you think I went? He said, I think you need to stick your tits out more, which I thought was excellent journalistic analysis. So I worked there for 2 years, then I went down to Sydney and worked at Channel 10 as a newsreader and reporter for about 14 years, which was marvellous, really enjoyed that. But you know, it's funny, I've kind of done my career backwards. I actually wish I had started off doing print and then moved into broadcast. I did it the other way around, but when I lost my job at Channel 10 6 or 7 years ago when I was on maternity leave, it sort of, I suppose, rekindled the fires of social justice in my system, and I thought what I really want to do is write about social issues and write about feminism, and that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years or so. So I do still a bit of news reading on Sky, a bit of radio broadcasting on 2UE, although it's kind of funny there, it's such a conservative joint. I feel like the only gay in the village, sort of Little Britain style, being a left-wing feminist. They call me the communist as I walk past. I heard one of them whisper it the other day. There goes the communist, and I was wearing red, so there you go. So I don't know how long I'll last there for. I write for the Daily Telly and the Sunday Telly, again, a bit like the only gay in the village there, and for the Hoopla as well. So finally, at the age of 45, I found where I feel like I'm supposed to be in the media.
I didn't think there were any communists anymore. A museum piece.
I didn't know that.
Well, I think I always wanted to be a journalist. I had an uncle who was a journalist and I was much influenced by him. I did arts at Melbourne University, politics particularly. But then when I tried to apply to newspapers both before and after doing that degree to the Australian and to the Age, they sort of said thanks but no thanks, go somewhere else. So I went to Monash University as a tutor in politics, and a while on, one of the students in my class was Peter Cole-Adams, who was at that time a sub-editor on the foreign desk of The Age, and I was lamenting to him one day that I'd always wanted to be a journalist. So he said, oh, well, I'll get you to get an interview for you with Graham Perkin, who of course was the legendary editor of The Age. So anyway, I got this interview, went along and said I was really interested in covering the industrial round, trade school, politics, and he said words to the effect, oh, Jesus, they swear a lot there, you know, bad language. Anyway, he obviously thought this was perhaps not a very good place to be, and he said, you're not in a hurry for a decision, are you? And I said no, and that was June, and it happened to be my birthday, and I was 27 at the time, and he thought this was very, very ancient for a journalist to be starting out. So anyway, I didn't hear anything for 6 months, and so I eventually rang up and said wasn't in a hurry then, but really do need some sort of decision by the end of the year. And again, a stroke of chance and luck. One of the people who taught me at Melbourne was Creighton Burns. He later went on to be a distinguished editor of The Age, but at that stage he was deputy or associate editor, and I think he put in a good word for me. I think he frankly persuaded Graham Perkin to give me a chance. And so I arrived in the newsroom, had to bring my own small typewriter because I was such a bad typist, that I really, it was the days when everyone sort of shared typewriters, it was impossible to cope with the others I found. And Jeff Barker, an Age journalist who was at that stage a leader writer and is around these days in Canberra, and a good friend, used to appear from the leader writer's room and watch me type as a sort of soothing diversion, maybe not soothing, a diversion. So that was my typing. And I was as untidy then as now, so I spread out over desks, and you were sharing desks and people complaining. And anyway, so that was my start on The Age. I was there for a very long time. As you said, I have moved around the Fairfax papers, indeed had 3 stints at The Age, and a brief stint when it wasn't in Fairfax's hands at the Canberra Times, which was an interesting experience in itself. Now I do work for The Conversation pretty intensively. The Conversation, if you don't know about it, is a university-based website which was conceived and started by Andrew Jaspin, a former editor of The Age, who I believe was a very good editor of The Age, and I think, sorry for the advertisement, but I do think that he's doing a good job in something that's quite new and innovative. And also, because you've got to be an academic to work for The Conversation, I also have a gig at the University of Canberra. So I've come back in a way to where I started out at Monash and now back in that academic role as well as the conversation role. So that's the story.
You must be getting very sore standing up there, just gazing over it. Pace yourself. Look, there's 3 genuine media people here. I'm kind of the imposter, I feel. I'm a testament to sheer luck and the role of chance in developing a career. I got a PhD in history. I went to University of Sydney. I studied history. I wanted to become an academic. I couldn't get an academic job, so I thought, oh bloody hell, my scholarship's running out. I better go and find a source of income. So I became a public servant. And they kept promoting me, and then I moved to Canberra, and I still don't, to this day, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, but I'm a bit closer now than I used to be when I was in the public service. I worked in really interesting areas. I worked in transport policy, which might sound a bit bland, but it's actually fascinating when you get down to the nitty-gritty. Then I moved to media policy in the Department of Communications, and that was absolutely fascinating, and it remains a fascination for me to this day about how we regulate media. And then this thing called the internet came along, and about 2000 I started sort of doing things on these new things called weblogs that the young folk were getting into, and later that got shortened to blogs, and I was doing that as well. And I kind of like the idea of just sort of writing whatever crap I liked online, whilst kind of just being pseudonymous and not having any connection with my real life persona. But eventually the two kind of merged, and I got approached by Crikey to take over from Christian Kerr, who was moving on, and who had until then been the political correspondent, and I took over from him about 5 years ago, and I've been doing it ever since, and it's the greatest job I've ever had, easily. But it's all been through luck, and I feel extraordinarily privileged that I got the sort of job I've got, because there's a lot of really great journalists who don't have jobs now, and I think they're better journalists than I ever will be. And they don't have jobs because of the nature of what's going on in the media at the moment. So I feel extraordinarily privileged, and as I said, it's the best job that I've ever had. The one thing I think I do okay, and the thing that I learned from being in the public service, is having to write very quickly a complex argument and condense it down so it will be understood by a politician. And that's a basic skill that you acquire in public service. And when, as I was in a position of having to explain digital television and digital television funding to Helen Coonan or Richard Alston, or very briefly, momentarily, Stephen Conroy, because I left about 5 minutes after he became minister. That really tests your capacity to actually take a complex issue, condense it down to a couple of paragraphs, and explain it to a person who is very busy and isn't across the brief necessarily, and who has to make an important decision involving millions of dollars. So that sort of skill is one that I did pick up in the public service, and really it's the basis for what I do now, which is to try to take apart the stuff that I see out there and explain it to people, and if necessary to kind of explain why it's wrong. And in a way, people used to talk about how new media was parasitic, kind of form. And to some extent, I actually agree with that, because a lot of what I do is I look at the stuff I see in the media and I say, well, that's a load of crap, and this is why, A, B, C, D. And if you've got any basic skills of rigorous thinking, then you can do that. And, you know, it's a living, it's a great living. I don't know what lessons you draw from that, except sometimes chance and good fortune are kind of, you know, the most important things that can guide you in a career.
That's how elevator music here. So obviously Benjamin has had quite a bit of experience in student media. Just out of interest, did any of you have anything to do with student media while you were at university? Not at all. That's a good sign, everyone.
I wrote letters to the editor like everyone else too. My first letter to the editor was actually in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was a poem making fun of Alan Ramsey. Most of you won't know who Alan Ramsey is. Laura Tingle.
That's very brave.
Yeah. I explained all this to Laura Tingle about 2 years ago. We were going back 20 years there. But I was approached by Mark Riley, who's Channel 7's political reporter, last year, and he said to me, Bernard, are you the person that sent that poem about Alan Ramsey to the Sydney Morning Herald in about 1987? And I said, yes. I confess that was me. So letters to the editor. I mean, is this the unsung and underappreciated mechanism for getting into the media? I mean, just putting that out there, folks.
There you are. Your path is set. Benjamin, because none of you can answer this question apart from Benjamin. I'm sorry. This is your specialty. This is your special topic. So you get bonus points on this round. What did you learn while you were editing the student newspaper? I think I'm still there. What did you learn? And what did you learn not to do?
Just to give you an idea of what our paper was, it was 6 issues across the year, and they were by theme, as a lot of student magazines and newspapers are. And I learned that I never want to be an editor again. I'm a writer, and I find it really hard to call the shots. There's this sexy game of charades going on between you two, and I'm getting very distracted. And you know, one of the great things about being an editor or working with editors in the same room, because now that I'm a freelancer and I work quite promiscuously with mainly between 4 editors at the moment. My bread and butter work is for Frankie magazine, Good Weekend, The Monthly, and Q Weekend in Queensland. And I very rarely see those editors at all. I haven't actually met John Van Tiegelen, the editor of The Monthly, at all. And I work, you know, closely with him when I write for them. What I learned, and what was a very valuable lesson for me as a writer to be an editor for that 1 year, was what ticks editors off, what editors are pleased by, what you look for in a story, what makes a good writer, what are really good interpersonal communication skills between a contributor or a prospective contributor and a writer. So even though it was a student magazine, I got a glimpse. I mean, it's not a magazine, but at least in that capacity, I got a glimpse of what an editor has to deal with day to day, and it's gruesome. It's gruesome. Editors deal with so much abuse. They have to call the shots, and sometimes it's not quite the right one, and they have to deal with the repercussions of that. Some of you are laughing in recognition. And the buck stops with you as well. And it's also one of the reasons why I am very respectful of my editors now, because I have to trust them implicitly with when I'm writing a piece and I'm not sure. I really want their advice as well, because I expect them to cover me in that sort of way too. So yeah, it teaches you why editors are so narky at you a lot of the time. I understand that.
Thank you. So all of us here are still university students, and perhaps one or two of us still have some kind of flexibility in what we study for the next few years. And I was just wondering, I've already had a chat a bit about this with Michelle, but whether any of you have any ideas about what kind of things you should get out of university, what kind of things you might consider studying, and what areas of study might be useful for journalists in the 21st century. Let's start with Bernard this time, right to left.
Okay, career advice time. Two things. One is, given the nature of what's going on in the media at the moment, if you do want to have a job in the media, then you're best to specialise. The chances of you are in very intense competition to get the generalist sort of jobs that are available in the media. If you specialise, if you're in economics, if you know economics, if you know law, if you know industrial relations, if you know science, then that does actually give you strings to your bow. That's the boring kind of career advice answer. Probably not more interesting, but my personal view is the thing that you've got to come out of higher education, and hopefully you come out of secondary education, but anyway, the thing that hopefully you'll come out of higher education with is a capacity for bullshit detection and rigorous thinking. And those two things will stand you in really good stead no matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you end up in the media or anywhere else. Those capacities of critical thinking are so important. And as a nation, I've kind of got this theory that we're diminishing our overall capacity for critical thinking. And that's a problem in our media, that's a wider problem amongst in our society, that's a problem amongst our politicians as well. So those skills of critical thinking, I think, are just fundamental to anything, no matter what you're doing.
Yes, I would agree very much with that. I don't think really it matters all that much what you study, but I think a degree where you've done really hard things and that you've studied areas of substance is the desirable way to go. I'm not a great rat, frankly, for journalism courses as such. I think that a more solid degree in a specialist area is better. But because there are so many people aspiring to get into the media and be journalists these days and so few jobs, in a way, it is a bit of a chance thing as to whether you can translate whatever you study into being able to obtain an actual position. But at least if you have law, if you have politics, economics, science, environmental science, whatever, then you have some choices. Your first choice might be journalism, but you also have other areas open to you, and I think that it's good to keep those options open. Can I just divert slightly and return to this question of editors, because I think that you raised some really interesting points, and it strikes me that one of the problems in the media these days is that the role of editors, certainly of editors of many newspapers, and newspapers is obviously more what I know about than other areas, but they are so distracted these days with all the things they have to do. They have become more like bureaucrats or company executives rather than editors in the sense that they were formerly. Now, this might be in a sense an old-fashioned view, but it does mean that they can give and have time to give, or less time to give, attention to the actual detail of the content that they're putting out. So they can't spend as much time, they don't spend as much time with the journalists looking at the origins of the story, helping the journalists know how to put together the story. I don't mean it just in an ordinary technical sense, but big stories in a wider sense. They are not as connected as they used to be themselves into whether it's their city or the political world or whatever. so they have less knowledge, in a sense, of the things that are going into the newspaper or that need to go into the newspaper or the online site or whatever. But this, I think, has been a change and is one that's making the role of editor, in a sense, diminished in terms of the content.
Thanks, Michelle. I concur with everything that you've said and Bernard said, but I want to delve a bit more deeply into this idea of specialisation, because I think it's very, very important. Ben and I were talking about this earlier about, you know, there's an increasing number of science journalists and journalists that specialise in politics and economics, and I think if you are going to do something added, politics and economics are right up there. But I think it's important to follow your heart, not your head, instead of sitting there and thinking, gee, there seem to be a lot of jobs for technology journalists at the moment. I know so many people who've gone into one area and then 20 or 30 years later thought, gee, that's not my passion. The secret to, you know, being good at your work, being successful in your career, and being happy in your life is to doing something that you're passionate about. So even if there don't seem to be a lot of journalism jobs in this particular area, if you're passionate about it, go for it. The other thing I'd say is, having sort of run my own business for the past 6 or 7 years and having done a couple of business subjects at university, I wish I had studied more of that. So if you can do something, you know, business that's an add-on, that's tremendous because it helps you run your own show down the track. The other thing is, I regret not doing further study. I simply did a degree, I didn't do honours, I didn't do a master's. Now look at going back and doing it now. And the thought of going back and studying now is quite confronting. You know, being a full-time worker and a middle-aged mother of 2 small children. So if you do have the time and the passion to do continuing study now, I'd highly recommend that you do it.
You get to go as well.
Sorry, what was the choice?
Okay. You have to keep in mind as well that about a generation ago, journalism groups didn't really exist, especially as they do now. And you'll find that a lot of, I mean, you'll find this in every area, whether it's daily newspapers or magazines or whatever, they don't actually care what you graduated with. They care that you can write. And what I actually recommend, and this isn't dismissing degrees like journalism and writing at all, what I often recommend, because I worked as a tutor for quite a few years at university in writing and non-fiction subjects, is that you get a lot of mistakes out of your system, you learn the skills. That's a really great thing that's a really great thing that journalism and writing degrees offer you. But I remember when I was going through university and we were doing a sub-editing and layout subject, and I was first year creative writing, and I was surrounded by final year journalism students, and they were all scrambling to get their bylines and their layout done in the student newspaper because that would be their only calling card once they graduated. And they realised this all of a sudden coming into their final year. And the journalism lecturers would sort of say on the side, you know, this won't be enough. You know, just having your byline in a student newspaper that goes out for free just to the student population will not be enough. What you do need is a track record elsewhere, and that's why from my first year onwards I was doing a lot of outside stuff as well, a lot of work experience, because once you build up a portfolio, what editors are interested in is demonstrating that you can write. And I agree with what was said before about this idea that if you can specialise within a certain field of knowledge, and you actually recognise what your passions and your strengths are as well, and not to deny yourself that you are a bit of a science nerd, that you are a bit of a pop culture king, that you are really into, I don't know, horse breeding or whatever, stuff that other people don't know. That is actually the knowledge bank that you take in with your work, and that's actually quite sellable, especially if you're going to work in a freelance market.
I was just going to go back to something that Tracey said. I mean, you are probably one of the poster childs for journalists as business people as well, as sort of taking hold of your financial security and doing something about it proactively. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've built your business, your communications business, and how that sort of works as, how do you consider yourself both a business person and a journalist?
Yeah, at the start, oh God, you would think I... Is that on? You would think I worked in broadcast journalism, sorry. What is this thing? It started off being a little bit like Uneasy Bedfellows. Having been just a straight up and down journalist and newsreader for all those years, I thought, God, how can I do the business thing ethically while tying in with the journalist thing and then becoming a commentator as well? And to be honest, I still find it a bit of an uneasy mix. I love it, but it's a very difficult balance. I have a lot of friends who are spin doctors. I don't do any spin doctoring because then I couldn't give a proper balanced interview on Sky News or on 2UE. If I had a client that I was going to interview, I just couldn't do that. I do a little bit of media training, but it's mainly for people who've never been in front of camera before, just to make them feel more comfortable, because I think that kind of balances the playing field a bit. With all of my writing and broadcasting and television, insofar as balancing the business side of that, I've learned to be tenacious, because when you run your own business, you're the one putting food on the table. You don't get the paycheck at the end of the week. 20 years ago, in fact even 10 years ago, the thought of calling a news director or an editor would have terrified me to the point of almost vomiting. I'm not very forward with or confident about applying for jobs. But now, because it's a necessity, and this is one of the great things about running your own business, you've got to make those phone calls, you've got to make those approaches. So I've learned how to network. And this is one of the great things about, look, I think it is the fourth wave of feminism at the moment. Women are learning to network better. So I'm going to a lot of functions, I'm meeting a lot of other women, a lot of other men, and collaborating with them. So I think if you've got your own business, you've got to be tenacious, you've got to be confident, you've got to be forthright, you've got to collaborate.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to keep on turning this on and off every time. This kind of reminds me of something, again, that we were talking about, Michelle, about the idea of journalists as characters, and perhaps what might be nowadays called journalists as brands, the branded journalist. And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on whether journalists should be trying to create a brand for themselves, or whether they should focus on the story and fade into the background. Let's start with Michelle.
Right, we're taking turns. Okay. Well, certainly I think this has been a trend in recent years. I don't know that it's a trend that I do like very much. You mentioned Andrew Bolt earlier. Andrew Bolt is one of the biggest brands, obviously, in the journalistic world. But so is Laurie Oakes, but very a different generation and a different sort of brand, because although everyone knows Laurie Oakes and has been an incredible newsbreaker, I think he is not a brand in the sense of a Bolt brand. He is a brand because of what he has done and the stories that he's broken and the respect that his commentary is given, rather than a more contrived brand, I guess you'd say. So I think there are real dangers in the whole brand thing, because I think one of the qualities of branding is probably the more outrageous you are, the more you can create a brand. And I think that the content of what you do and what you say should not be directed by attempting to make yourself into a brand. I think that really has a lot of very negative aspects.
Bernard, would you like to say anything?
Look, I agree with everything Michelle said, and that's actually a really good analysis. There are earned brands and there are confected brands. But branding is going to become more and more important, unfortunately. And Andrew Bolt's the kind of the on the cutting edge here. I mean, he provides certainty for his readers. It's not very good analysis. It's frequently wrong, usually wrong. But it provides certainty. You know what you're going to get if you're an Andrew Bolt reader. And there's a lot of people who actually like that. They don't want the unexpected. They want to be told what they already know. And there is money to be made from that, and that's why Andrew Bolt is a big brand. I don't want to single out Andrew Bolt. I don't particularly like Andrew, but he's not to be singled out ideologically. I think we should single him out as a business example of where, unfortunately, I think Australian media is going to go, because as the media environment fragments, and as revenue becomes harder and harder to obtain, then branded things are easier to monetize. So that's where we're going to go, and that's why we've seen the rise of branded journalists. I mean, Annabelle Crabbe, I like Annabelle a lot. I think she does excellent work. She's a brand. Michelle's a brand. To a very lesser extent, I'm a brand. People will, by a brand I mean people go to you because they have an idea of what you're going to give them, and they like what you're going to give them. Now, what you give them is going to differ. What Andrew Bolt gives you is going to be different from what Michelle gives you, what Laurie Oates gives you. And the brand, as I said at the start, is going to be very different. There are earned brands, there are brands that have been achieved because a journalist has performed for 30 or 40 years, breaking stories, providing excellent insight and analysis, and being a leading journalist. Or there are commentators who simply give you what you expect. Nonetheless, this is where journalism is going, and I just don't know where that leaves us in a way, because I don't think it's a particularly healthy development in terms of the quality of debate and public life. I think it necessarily ends up degrading the quality of public debate, but in terms of a shrinking, diminishing media environment, I'm not sure there's much we can do about it.
Tracey?
Yeah, a couple of points about that. I think more of a problem than the branded journalists is the overt political agenda of a lot of the mainstream media, and the overt political agenda of a lot of the new media and social media as well. I'm not quite so pessimistic about the future of journalism or the future of commentary, because I think we have so many different sources now. And I relish that, and I love new media, and I love social media, I love the fact that I can read Bernard's stuff. And I know it's independent, I know he's not having any pressure on him from, a Murdoch or even from a Fairfax to take this angle. I just want to talk about what I've seen in the media in the last 24 hours. If you read the Daily Telegraph this morning, there were 3 opinion pieces over 2 pages, all of them from right-leaning commentators. If you looked at the Sydney Morning Herald, it was interesting. There were 3 columns, all wonderful, beautiful Waleed Ali column, but all left-leaning. And I thought, wow, this is, obviously the way things are going. And what worries me as consumers of media, and I'm really conscious of this, is that, I follow the New York Times and the Guardian, and I read Crikey and stuff, but I don't want to only limit myself to left-wing sources, otherwise you get a really narrow view of the world that's preaching to the converted. I think more of a worry than branded journalists are the media brands going forward. Look, I worry in particular, as a lot of us do, about the Murdochs. I don't know whether you saw the Ab Fab cartoon. It's becoming more like a bloody comic strip than a newspaper. I tell you, they had Patsy and Eddie, Gillard and Swan. But what was worse was the wording. It was entirely biased, like an opinion piece. So I think what I worry about more going forward is this merging of opinion and news.
Benjamin?
There are a few things I want to bring up. The first is that when I hear of people trying to purposefully brand themselves, I feel like I've stepped on a snail with my bare foot. I feel this, intuitive revulsion. And I do actually go to events and seminars where people talk about how they've purposefully branded themselves, and it just strikes me as really gross. At the same time, I've been accused of manufacturing a brand. They're like, oh yeah, you're that gay Asian guy. And I'm like, I can't help that. I didn't manufacture that. Maybe I did. Pull off my yellow face mask in a second. But at the same time, what's interesting is that when people say that I have a brand, is that their conception of what my brand is completely different and varies, and sometimes in conflict with other people's perceptions of what I do. Some people come to me and they're like, oh, you're that, that gross out guy who writes for Frankie, and you're young and you're gay and you're Asian and you write pop culture stuff. And then other people come to me and they know that I write really earnest, serious stuff for some other publications sometimes. And I think that's actually a result of what I was saying before about being quite professionally promiscuous, in that in my working week, just in this 1 week, I've been working on a long-form piece for Good Weekend about sexual abuse between siblings, so very serious. And then in the middle of the week, I started work again on developing a sitcom for SBS, which is different. And then the third thing that I wrote was working on a column about Game of Thrones for News Limited. So these are very different things, and people come to my work from very different angles, and I think so much of your control over what your brand apparently is out of your hands. You think, I mean, what I find might be the mistake of some people trying to purposely brand themselves is that they think they've got control over how people see them, but they don't necessarily. And I think that's another danger that you might want to think about as well.
Thanks. By the way, panel, if you want to respond to anything that one of the other panelists has said, just lunge for the microphone or put up your hand on a conversation. Going back to what Tracey was saying about the sort of polarisation of media outlets and moving along to our sort of next large heading of the future of media, I wondered if I could get your thoughts on the impact of all this choice of being able to go online and read any newspaper or media outlet that you want from anywhere in the world, what impact that has on people who might decide that they only want to hear from one particular source. Are we going to see really, really polarised groups of people in society who are only getting their information from one source? Or do you think that it's going to work itself out, that media outlets online are going to become more responsible and present a range of opinions? And since that was picking up on something you said, Tracey, let's start with you.
Look, I do think we'll see a greater polarisation. I do worry about that as consumers, like I said before, we're almost narrow casting what we're receiving and what we're consuming. And I do think there's a role for government here. You know, people might cry, oh, bloody nanny state, over-regulation. But I do think we need to have a diversity of news. The great thing about globalisation is we can get news from absolutely anywhere. So, like I said before, I'm an optimist on this. I think there's going to be such a diversity of sources. It's up to us as consumers to open our eyes and our ears to all of them.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is a paradox. On one level, we're getting much more media and many more outlets. But on the other hand, we're getting, or at least most consumers are getting a more concentrated media and actually fewer voices, because in the mainstream media, the old media, which after all gets the greater attention of the vast, or at least the majority of the population, you really are seeing less diversity, and that's why I think it's bad that the government so bungled its recent reforms, which I thought were relatively mild and would have actually been useful if they'd been passed. But it is great that there is all this new media, and many people will pick it up and use it and get those wider viewpoints, but you only had to look at the coverage of the media reforms to realise how concentrated the mainstream media is and what sort of impact it can have when it's speaking with one voice. And I think that that is a quite alarming situation, and that while we should celebrate the new media and while we should celebrate the fact that we can read easily material from overseas in real time and so on, we shouldn't be blind to the fact that for the bulk of the population, the media is very, very concentrated. And just a footnote to this, if you talk to politicians, as I've been recently, obviously trying to say, read the conversation, and it's not really hard to find it. You can just Google the conversation. You suddenly become aware of the extent to which the politicians, who after all you think would be across new media, are absolutely hooked into old media, and you sort of need to send someone down to them to actually say, let's Google, and you just have to type in the conversation and it will come up, or Crikey, or whatever. So, yeah, I think there is a real problem on this diversity front. All that.
But that reminds me of a story that Laura Tingle tells about Alan Ramsey, which is that he told her once that there's this great thing that you can go to the parliamentary library and they've got this fantastic thing called Google where they can research for you. Look, two things. 40 years ago, there was more or less a single media space. It might have been made up of newspapers and TV and radio, but more or less there was a single media space in which everyone operated. And you didn't have a choice about the ideas you confronted. You even if you didn't agree with what sort of ideas are floating around, you had to kind of be confronted with them and deal with them. We've now moved to an environment where it's very easy to pick and choose what media you consume, and therefore what ideas you're exposed to, and therefore, as it's frequently been commented, you do get this echo chamber effect, and it's on the left and it's on the right as well. You pick out the people that you agree with, and you tend to pay more attention to them, and you're not exposed as much to different ideas because we've lost that unitary media space. We've got a very fragmented media space. So that's a problem. I don't know what to do about that. That's simply the nature of the fact that we've empowered people about the media they consume. The other issue is disengagement, and I think Australians are more disengaged now on politics than they used to be. I can remember about in the early 1990s when Stan Grant, who was then at that stage the host of a current affair, it might be Today Tonight, but it was a current affair. Today Tonight. And he interviewed Paul Keane, who was Prime Minister. I mean, he actually interviewed the Prime Minister on Today Tonight. Now, I can't remember the last time a senior politician was interviewed on tabloid TV. And it's not because tabloid TV is automatically evil, it's because people don't want to see politicians at 6:30. And I think that the amount of space that's devoted on the commercial evening news bulletins to politics is also diminished. For the same reason that the producers who put together those programs think this stuff just doesn't rate. So they'll get a quick 90 seconds from Laurie or Mark or Paul or Hugh, but they're more interested in car crashes on Parramatta Road or wherever it is. And of course a live cross to the person standing on Parramatta Road to talk about what happened 6 hours ago. Because that demonstrates you can do stuff that you can't get online. So that disengagement, it seems to me, is more problematic, in an age where we can pick and choose. But it worries me that most Australians, I suspect, only get their political news from the 90 seconds that they see on that commercial TV news bulletin. Not because our commercial TV news journalists aren't good, they are excellent journalists, but ultimately they can call their producers who decide how much detail, how much information goes into those news bulletins. So that's that disengagement that I think is perhaps every bit as problematic as the fragmentation and the echo chamber.
It's one reason for the disengagement that, in a sense, there's too much media and people feel that they're shouted at excessively and they can't stand it anymore. It's not the only reason, but it does seem to me that people have retreated because the talk just now goes on. We talk about the 24-hour news cycle, but it is more or less continuous, and people say enough, whereas when they were getting it more in a half-hour block here, a news bulletin there, and so on, it wasn't assaulting them in the face all the time. And when you have politics that's as fractious as it has been recently, then people just feel that they don't want to hear this anymore.
The tempo of coverage, I think, has gone up, and that means it's everything's a crisis. Yeah, everything's a crisis. Everything's a debacle. Everything's chaos. Everything's the government's on the verge of collapse. Back in the 80s and 90s, and look, people my age and older just hark back to the 80s and 90s as some sort of golden age of economic reform and canny politics and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't like that back then. It was more earthier and more real. But nonetheless, it seems to me that tempo and the tenor of political coverage back then wasn't as intense and febrile and high-pitched and hysterical as it is now. And I don't blame viewers for kind of recoiling from constantly being told that everything is disastrous and everything is chaos, because it just gets a little bit weary. You can only stay on edge for so long.
And the audience too, I think, was getting more summaries of what was happening and snapshots of what was happening rather than hearing it all day, every day.
I promise I won't take up too much of your airtime, but there's just some excellent points there. Look, I think that's right. I think people are sick of the 24-hour news cycle. They're sick of the bias. Every barbecue I go to, that sounds very cliche, but it's true. People say, why can't we just get the facts? Why can't we get the straight story? So I think people are disenchanted. But it's interesting, you still look at the top 10 TV programs. A Current Affair, Today Tonight, and Channel 9 and Channel 7 News are still 4 of the top 10. So even though people say they're sick of it, they're still buying into a lot of this shallow rubbish. I just want to share a brief anecdote from my most recent time on Talkback Radio on TV. And I love interviewing politicians. I love trying to give them a hard time. I was told not to interview politicians because people turn off. So I think we've got to demand more robust political coverage and not turn away from it. That's my thought on that.
Sum it all up then.
In conclusion, I also think a lot of it has to do with media literacy as well, because I remember when I was 17 years old and going through university undergrad for the first time, and we did a subject that no longer exists at my university called Media and Society, where we learned about media ownership for the first time and learned actually how media structure works. And I was very smug, and I was working at a news agency at the time, and dishing out newspapers. And I come from, like I said, I was living in Brisbane, which is one paper town. Essentially still is technically with newspapers. We've got the Brisbane Times, which is Fairfax, but exclusively online now. And I remembered selling newspapers, and a guy came up and bought a newspaper, and he said that he didn't want the Courier Mail, he wanted the Australian because he doesn't like that Murdoch-owned stuff. And I'm like, well, and you know, at 17 years old, you feel quite smug about like, oh, well, little do you know. But I think the fact that I had to go to university to learn that sort of stuff formally, that's not a broader conversation that happens amongst the Australian public. So when we talk about media diversity, social media, I'm very optimistic about that stuff as well. And I've often said on panels and in conferences, if you want to find it, you just have to look. You have to just Google the conversation. You go to Crikey, you find New Matilda. There are independent voices out there that are quite robust and regular as well, if you want to find it. But most people still don't know where to look, and I think I'm speaking from a privileged position from working in the media, having studied media as well, but I don't think that's the majority of people out there. So when we talk about the tone of the mainstream media, when we talk about where those big broadcast and print outlets are heading, that is actually still a concern.
Well, turning unfortunately away from why audiences aren't buying our stuff and more to how we go about the dirty art of journalism. Most of the people here are covering, for the large part, huge, big, unwieldy, unaccountable organisations known as universities. They're highly bureaucratic, they're almost petrified, a lot of them, of information disclosure. And it can be very difficult for people often who have absolutely no training in how to squeeze blood out of stone to get information. And I was wondering if any of you had any good tips for dealing with huge organisations that have a lot of means at their disposal to... Well, Bernard having worked for one of them, or more than one of them, might have some tips. How do we get information from people who don't want to give it?
Okay. First thing is, don't go to the media offices, because you will not get anything useful from them. Their job is to make sure you don't get anything useful. And when I was public servant, one of my jobs was, when we got an FOI request, to make sure that we didn't provide any material that might in any way be embarrassing at the moment, or be embarrassing in the future. So you had to kind of make sure that you gave nothing away. And that was an enjoyable kind of intellectual challenge, but now that I'm on the other side of the fence, I take a different view. There's a guy called Barrett Brown, who is currently in jail in Texas. He's a journalist and writer and online activist and an occasional alleged spokesperson for Anonymous, a role that he frequently denied. Barrett, and I wrote about this in Crikey today, Barrett was, until he was locked up by the FBI, a very diligent journalist about the US cybersecurity industry, and wrote some very excellent pieces on that industry, how it works and its relationships with the government. One of the things he used to do was he would record his phone calls and put them online. It was all about transparency. And one of the things that, one of the recordings he put online once was he rang up the head of a very prominent US defence company and got through to him and began asking him a series of difficult questions about that company's involvement in some controversial practices. And the head of the company said, look, I think it really might be more useful if you talk to our media area. And he said, well, I think actually it might be more useful if I talk to you. And he just kept on at him and kept on at him. And I invoked that partly because Barrett's in jail, and I want to sort of get people to be aware of what's happened to Barrett. But also because I thought that was a really good example of good practice, which is don't go to the media areas who are charged with deceiving you. Go to the people in charge, and you might get rebuffed. You probably will get rebuffed, but there's always a chance you'll actually get something out of them that you're not going to get out of the people who are in charge of actually making sure you don't get anything. So that's the first step, is go to the people who actually are the decision makers, the people in power, rather than the people who are charged with making sure that you don't get any information.
I think that's excellent advice. I think it's sometimes harder for people to actually follow, particularly for people starting out in journalism. I know when I was first in Canberra, the public service was in fact much more accessible, I think, to journalists now than it is now. And there was a Commonwealth Directory which came out in paper form, which everyone had a copy of, which had numbers, sometimes even home numbers, but certainly direct office lines, and you could talk to public servants, and if they trusted you, they would talk to you on background, and your understanding of issues became much enhanced by that. Now, at the moment, people in many public servants will just tell the journalists to go to the media offices and even to just go to the ministerial offices, because the departments, even the media parts of the department, defer these days to the ministerial media. So it is a nightmare, there's no doubt about that, and especially for people starting out. I think that the message, though, of being persistent, of trying to amass enough knowledge about an area that you can ask intelligent questions, if necessary submitting questions in writing so that people have to say, I won't answer that question, sometimes is useful. I think also building up a reputation for being accurate and being willing to check back facts and check back quotes. Now, this latter point is a more controversial one. Some practitioners would be horrified at that advice. I usually find that you get more out of it than you lose, that people usually don't retreat from what they've said, and they may pick up errors, or they may go further, they may expand on the points they want to make. So just at a practical level, I think that's about the advice I could give, but I do sympathise with the frustrations of dealing with big institutions as a reporter.
God, I can't believe I have to follow Michelle Grattan on this. I'm still going to go with the embarrassment of fawning over you when I first met you, but I'm not sure I'll get over that. Look, I'll approach this from another angle, because I've only ever done short form, I've never done investigative journalism or an awful lot of long form stuff. What I would like to say is nurture whistleblowers. And this is not something out of the movies or, you know, some kind of mini-series. Some of the best stories, and they're not world-breaking stories, but they were little exclusive stories that I stumbled upon, are from simply talking to people and overhearing conversations in cafes. And talking to people, chatting to people at parties, chatting to people at organisations, and, you know, over a few drinks they'll leak something. Whether they meant to leak it or not doesn't matter. Then you nurture that contact and you build up a story from that. Then you take it to these dreadful organisations that you have to get a comment from. And when you do that, never take no comment for an answer. And if they keep refusing to give you an interview or to give you information, then embarrass them. I've noticed 730's doing that an awful lot. If they're trying to get a comment out of someone and they won't go on the show, they just blatantly embarrass them. So use whatever power you have to get them to comment.
When I wrote my first long-form story for News Limited, I was almost sued, and so was the magazine. And I mean, this doesn't speak directly to the question of how to interrogate universities as an institution if you're writing for a student magazine or if you're editing one. But when it comes to big institutions or whatever they are, look, every time, because I didn't do a formal journalism degree, and I definitely didn't, to my utter mortification and regret, I never did the media and law degree, media and law subject either. So every time I wade into another serious long-form piece, whether it's for Fairfax or News Limited, there is an aspect of the story that frightens me and that I don't understand. And I think what you have to do, if you're in that position, is to recognise when you're in that position and know who to ask in terms of how they can clarify the situation for you. I'm lucky because that's my editor's job. I'm dealing with one story at the moment where there are a lot of court suppression orders for different reasons, where identities have to be obscured, and I wasn't particularly sure about what my, how far I could go in writing certain details about certain people. So that was a collaborative exercise with my editor. For that story where I was almost sued, that was a collaborative exercise between me, my editor, and News Limited's lawyers, who I felt very, very grateful for that I was on their side, because they're absolute bastards. You want to make sure that they're fighting for you and not against you. So my advice is, I mean, if you're at university especially and you have a journalism faculty there, you will have journalism lecturers who know this stuff and will have your back as well. Ask them these questions.
Thanks. Sort of continuing on in the theme, and just as we kind of move towards the question section of the night, I was wondering if you could talk about the best journalist you think is practicing in Australia, apart from the people in this room, and that includes me. Don't want to hear my name. And if you like, also the worst, if you're willing. And less for the name, but more why you think so. Who should we be emulating and who should we be avoiding? If you don't have to say, you don't have to go to worst if you. But best. I'm sure you can answer best and it'll be nice on Twitter, right? Ben, let's start with you. Who do you think is the best journalist in Australia, apart from the people sitting next to you?
Well, I'm going to talk more about long form because that's the type of journalism that I'm interested in. I think that Australia has a very good tradition of long form journalists as well. I find we seem to foster it, or there's something about the stories that we write that seem to get people into the field. I'm going to be very biased and say one writer I really like is Anna Keane. She's a very good friend of mine as well, but that's why I bring her up. She recently wrote a quarterly essay about the relationship between people and animals, which sounds very Corey Bernardi, but it's not what you think. And she's just written a book about sex and power and rape within football culture that's coming out later this year. And she's about to start writing more robustly for Good Weekend after she's just had a baby, and I think she's really fantastic. Who else do I like? One of my role models is actually John Birmingham. because what I really like about him is he's completely omnivorous with what he reads and what he writes as well. You can't really pin him down. And what he's taught me, I mean, he's a fellow Brisbanean, what he's taught me is that you don't have to be pinned down as a freelancer, because I work completely freelance. And what I like is that when you talk about brand as well, how can you pin down John Birmingham as a brand? He's a guy who writes speculative novels about World War III, and he blows shit up. And he's also someone who will write, a quarterly essay about relationships with Jakarta as well. And he's also someone who will write vitriolic columns about, other columnists at News Limited as well. So I like what he's done with his career. I like how he's proceeded.
It's such a hard question because there are so many different forms, and as Benjamin said, so many people who are excelling in their particular niche. Look, I'm going to stalk someone who's a friend of mine, Lee Sales. I think she's just amazing. And her interview with Tony Abbott just blew my head off. I fell off the couch. I think Laurie Oakes is exceptional because he writes so well and broadcasts so well, and I think Laurie's extraordinary. Gosh, who else? I know we talked about brands before. I love what Annabelle Crabb's done. I think she's terribly clever. Insofar as worst, that I'm not going to name her because I can see we're being filmed here and I'm worried about ending up somewhere.
What does she rhyme with?
That'll give it away. And she's a rising star at News Limited, and I really don't like the news pieces that she writes because they are opinion pieces and should be on the opinion page, and I don't like that trend. So no, I shall not name her.
What are her initials?
Well, it is a very hard question. I want to mention Kate McClymont. I think that the things that she does, the investigation, the really hard issue, those complicated stories that are full of legal traps and many dark characters, and putting all that together, whether it's reporting or investigating, reporting inquiries and so on, or investigating. If you look at her body of work over recent times, I think it's fantastic. I like some of the profile writers' work, Jane Cadso and Tom Dusevic. Tom wrote this wonderful piece about, which I think is comforting to us all, this piece about Bob Carr, and Bob Carr always sounds so authoritative and so on, but Tom had these anecdotes in the story about how Bob Carr in his maiden speech managed to get the date of the Sydney Olympics wrong, even though he'd been premier at the time. And he told Tom a couple of times during the course of this profile, apparently, that he'd been interviewed by Fred Smith or whoever, and it turned out that Fred Smith had interviewed last week by Fred Smith, and Fred Smith had died 2 years ago. And so I thought the whole richness of this profile was so good, and I do think that Tom, when he writes profiles, does an exceptionally good job. And of course I mentioned Laurie Oakes before in terms of his news reporting and his commentary, a lifetime of incredible work. And I remember when he was on the Melbourne Sun, and I started out as political correspondent on The Age, or in that job, and if at midnight Laurie didn't have anything, you went to bed without worrying any further about any other news outlet.
I'm a fan of Laurie Oakes. To get a sense of his rigour, you've only got to watch him during the 2010 election campaign bagging Channel 9 for paying Mark Latham to go and hold the election campaign to get a sense of his commitment to quality public debate. For me, the question is who I will read no matter what, and I'll make an effort to read, and that's Lenore Taylor, Catherine Murphy, Phil Coorey, I'm a big fan of Andrew Probe of the West Australian, but he's constrained by the fact that he writes for the West Australian, and they've got the world's worst website. It's just awful, and then it's just a shocker. Kerry Sochi, it really is. You think Kerry would have enough money to actually make sure the lawyer has a decent website. But anyway, I mean, they're sort of gallery journalists who I will read no matter what. The worst journalists, well, I know I won't name anyone, but the journalists who really annoy me most are the ones who are too lazy or who have been told by their editors to write pieces that have no rigour, no sort of foundation, no evidence, are purely agenda-driven pieces. And whether it's cyber security or asylum seekers or what Tim Matheson will get by way of superannuation in case Julia Gillard dies. I'm giving a hint there. Those sort of journalists.
That's a very innovative idea.
Yeah. Exactly. Those sort of journalists who are too lazy or because they're happy to write to direction who produce that sort of rubbish. I just really, public debate would be much better off without it.
Thank you. Well, I'm sad none of you mentioned the headline writers of the Northern Territory News. So I think it must be amongst the best journalists in Australia. Now we've reached that wonderful time of the evening where you can ask your own questions rather than my boring ones. So I think we have a roaming microphone.